Last time we talked about Locke's arguments against the doctrine that there are innate ideas, principles, or innate knowledge. That is, we talked about Locke's anti-nativism. And we said then that it's important to keep in mind when looking through those arguments against nativism that the other side of Locke's argument is going to be the positive one is, well, what is he going to say? What is his account of knowledge going to be? Can he give an empiricist account of how we get these different ideas? And so that's what we're going to start to talk about today. How is the mind furnished? And what we see here in this picture is some people looking at an image created in a camera obscura where the light comes into a darkened room. And here's another image of the same camera obscura. This is in San Francisco. A more recent image here in color, and here you can see how it works. The light comes in and it goes onto a mirror and you can look at the image. And now it says here camera obscura, and it implies that the translation is giant camera. Well, it is a giant camera because you're inside this room where the image is projected, but actually camera obscura means dark room. Okay, so at the end of last time we were talking about this idea from Locke that the mind begins as a blank slate, a tabula rasa. He says external and internal sensation, that is what he elsewhere calls sensation and reflection, are the windows by which light is led into this dark room. Right? So the Latin there would have been camera obscura. So the ideas we get from sensation and reflection, he analogizes to the light coming into a darkened room. Not unlike a closet wholly shut from light, with some little opening left to let in external resemblances or ideas of things without. So this is just another metaphor for this idea that the mind has no innate ideas, that it's, in this metaphor, completely dark until light comes in from outside. And in this image of the camera obscura, the light comes in and in a way that gives us information about what's outside. In this case, projects an image of what's outside. I also mentioned last time that in the essay, as we have it now, the term tabula rasa does not appear. Nevertheless, this idea that the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, is the most common way that people talk about Locke's view against innate ideas. And here's just another image of a modern camera obscura, which is to say a dark room into which only a pinhole of light comes through in a way that can project an image. And it's interesting that in an early draft of the essay, Locke actually did use a version of this term tabula rasa. This is in what's called the draft B of the essay from 1671. You remember that he finished the essay in 1689, and here he says, very similar to the claim in the published version in Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 2, he said, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas." And here we see that in this draft, he says, "It being then probable to me that there is no notion, idea, or knowledge of anything originally in the soul, but that at first it is perfectly rasa tabula, quite void, but altogether capable of those characters, notion, or ideas which are the proper objects of our understandings," and so forth. So he himself used the version of that Latin term in his draft, but the term tabula rasa became associated, especially with Locke's view, probably because of the French translation from 1700 from Pierre Coste, where in English it says that the mind is, as we say, a white paper. Here he says, in the French, as we say, a tabula rasa. And just to give you a sense of what this tabula rasa itself would be, in ancient Greece and Rome, when you were especially learning how to write, you would use a wax tablet, shown here on the far left. You can see the depiction of someone using one. No, that's not a laptop. He has a tablet, or in Greek, a grammaton, and you would scratch with a stylus into the wax, practice your writing, and then when you were done, you would erase. And the tabula rasa is the Latin term, coming probably originally from an analogy used by Aristotle to talk about the mind. It would be wrong to think that Aristotle is saying exactly the same thing as Locke does later. Nevertheless, we can trace some of the history of this metaphor back to Aristotle. Aristotle says in De Anima, "Thus it must be just as in a tablet, in which nothing exists in actuality written down, which occurs in the case of the mind." So at least Aristotle has this idea that the mind has a certain kind of potentiality onto which letters can be scratched, in this case for the wax tablet. Okay, so that's the basic metaphor. Now we want to know, how is it, in fact, that this blank slate of the mind gets filled with letters or characters? We saw last time already that Locke's claim is that the only two sources are sensation and reflection. So in Section 3 of Chapter 1 of Book 2, Locke tells us that sensation is when external sensible objects, which he also calls material things, affect the senses. That's when we have sensation. Sensation conveys the ideas of what he calls sensible qualities. For example, yellow, heat, soft, bitter. These are all the sensible qualities that we get. We get them from these external sensible objects, and therefore Locke says that sensation we can call an external sense. But that's not the only source. We said we can also get ideas from reflection. This is a distinct source of ideas. When the soul comes to reflect on and consider its own operations, that is when we engage in reflection, and we can get ideas of reflection. Reflection conveys the ideas of what Locke calls here mental actings. Examples of ideas we get not from external things, but from reflection, are the ideas of perception, thinking, willing, uneasiness, or some displeasure of some kind. So Locke says that this is an internal sense. And Locke states that sensation is going to be first. Insofar as how the mind is filled, it's going to start with sensations, and then the operations of the mind are going to act on those sensations, and then at that stage one can reflect on what those operations are. So the ideas that come from reflection are distinct. They're not merely sensory ideas or the same as ideas of sensation, but the sensation does come first. And so, as we noted last time, the basic claim here is talking about a person growing up, a child, does not have any idea in his mind, but what one of these two, namely sensation and reflection, have imprinted. And so one of the consequences of this Locke says is that, for example, if a child were kept in a place where he never saw anything but black and white till he were a man, he would have no more ideas of scarlet or green than he that from his childhood never tasted an oyster or a pineapple has of those particular relishes or tastes. And so it doesn't matter how common ideas are. If they're so common and universal, we maybe tend to think they're innate. Well, probably not many people are going to say the color scarlet is innate, but the basic idea here is he's just, with this thought experiment, calling our attention to the fact that whatever ideas we have are because we've been exposed to them and got them through experience. And at the end of this first chapter of Book 2, kind of looking back then on what he covered and what we're about to talk about, Locke says, all those sublime thoughts which tower above the clouds and reach as high as heaven itself take their rise and footing here, which is to say, from sensation and reflection, those simple ideas that come in sensation and the operations of our mind as we combine those sensations, compare them, and so forth, all the ideas that we get of those higher things, whatever they are, can have no other source than that. Although Locke does actually leave a little wiggle room in some of the texts, you may have noticed, he says that there's no natural way to get ideas, sort of leaving room. There could be, it's at least logically possible or metaphysically possible that God would give us some special insight or revelation, but there's no natural way to get knowledge other than through experience. So before we talk more about his account of the simple ideas, what they are, the different sources, and how they get combined, we'll talk about a little bit of a digression that Locke gets into at this point after introducing this basic distinction between sense and reflection. He takes the opportunity here to attack Descartes. He doesn't attack him by name, and he's maybe thinking not only about Descartes, but maybe some of Descartes' followers. But this is an example of the way that Locke objects to these kind of metaphysical speculations about the nature of the mind, and he wants to show how those speculations have bad consequences for clear thinking about what our power of knowing is. And so I think we can identify Descartes as the target when Locke says here in section 9 of chapter 1, he says, I know it is an opinion that the soul always thinks. So I take this to be a reference to Descartes because the thought that the soul always thinks is closely connected with the thought that the mind, as Descartes defines it, is a thinking thing. That's the essence of the mind. When you discover that you exist, what is it that exists? It's whatever it is that thinks. So thinking is essential to the mind. And a bit later, in section 15, the middle of page 86 of our edition, Locke actually uses this term thinking thing, and he references those who make the soul a thinking thing. So I think it's pretty clear that Locke has Descartes in mind. So against this view of Descartes, or this Cartesian view, Locke says that he, of course, admits that perception is an activity of the soul. It's something we do, but he's going to disagree with this Cartesian thought that thought is the essence of the soul, which is to say that if we didn't think, we would be nothing. Locke wants to say we can leave room for the thought of a soul that's not thinking at any particular time. And Locke approaches this question with a thought experiment, of which we'll see many more throughout our courses of discussion of Locke. Locke basically asks, am I not conscious of my own thinking during a dreamless sleep? So Locke is calling attention to the fact that when we wake up, it doesn't seem like we've been thinking the whole time we were asleep. He says, experience tells us that we often have sleep without any dreams. So what is the Cartesian going to say about that? If I'm not thinking while I'm asleep, then it seems that I'm nothing. Of course, the Cartesian is going to say, well, when you're asleep, maybe you're thinking, there's thought going on, you just don't remember it when you wake up. There's thought but no memory. And Locke's response to this point is a little difficult to follow, but it also anticipates something we're going to be talking about next week with Locke's account of personal identity. So there's kind of a preview here of Locke's account of personal identity. Locke says that if you were to say that the sleeping person thinks but the waking person doesn't remember, then you'd have to say that there's this other person who's asleep. He's doing all the thinking. There's thinking going on. He's a person, right? He would say, I think, therefore I am, and all of that, asleep though. But that would then, Locke says, be a different person than the waking person. So Locke says here in section 11, talking about this possibility, he says, I grant that the soul in a waking man is never without thought, because it's the condition of being awake. But whether sleeping without dreaming be not an affection of the whole man, mind as well as body, may be worth a waking man's consideration. There's a little joke on Locke's part. It being hard to conceive that anything should think and not be conscious of it. So there we're getting back to a theme that we saw already in Locke's attack against nativism, this thought that you could think and not be conscious, that we could have ideas and not be aware of it. That's his first point. How could this be that the sleeping soul is thinking, but one never is aware of what that is? How could that be possible? But then his other side of this dilemma for this view, this Cartesian view of the res cogitans, he says, or if it be possible that the soul can, whilst the body is sleeping, have its thinking, enjoyments and concerns, its pleasure or pain, a part which the man is not conscious of nor partakes in, it is certain that Socrates asleep and Socrates awake is not the same person. But his soul sleeps when he sleeps, and Socrates the man, consisting of body and soul when he is waking, are two persons, since waking Socrates has no knowledge of or concernment for that happiness or misery of his soul which it enjoys alone by itself, whilst he sleeps without perceiving anything of it, any more than he has for the happiness or misery of a man in the Indies whom he knows not. So this is a real anticipation of a point we're going to get into more depth about later, this thought that what is a person? What would it be to be the same person? It's not just that you are metaphysically one soul, because in this case the sleeping Socrates and the waking Socrates, maybe there's thought going on in the sleeping Socrates, but if the waking Socrates knows nothing about it, and if the sleeping Socrates is thinking, but the sleeping Socrates doesn't know what the waking Socrates is doing, they're two people because they each represent two different points of view on the world. And the fact that they represent these 2 points of view on the world is indicated with this discussion here that Locke brings in about concernment for happiness or misery. When I plan for the future, I plan for my own future, not for this sleeping person who supposedly thinks all the while I am asleep. And that is the point of the other thought experiment in the next section. I'm not going to go into the details right now, but this idea that there could be one soul that switches between the bodies of two men, and are they going to be two people or one person? This again is this kind of thought experiment that Locke is an expert at, and he uses in order to make his points, in this case, about the nature of the soul, and kind of arguing against the metaphysical view of Descartes that the soul we know to be, in essence, a thinking thing. Locke says, no, the soul is something I have, and it thinks. I'm not going to be able to say it has this or that essence, or that it wouldn't be something if it's not thinking. And that's the context that he raises these points here. Okay, so then this brings us to the beginning in earnest of Locke's account of how the blank slate of the mind is furnished with ideas, perceptions, and so forth through sensation and reflection. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to discuss this word idea that we see in Locke. Now, the word idea means different things in different philosophers. You could trace it back to Greek philosophy. It's actually the etymology is from Greek, and it's coming through Plato and the idea of the forms as the idea. However, for Locke, the term idea stands for just the most general mental entity. And that means, in the first place, that when Locke uses the term idea, he doesn't mean a general concept, or at least that's not the only meaning of it. He does talk about general ideas, but I think maybe sometimes in English we might want to distinguish, I have an idea about something. When I use the word idea, it has a meaning of something more abstract, something like that, than ordinary perceptions. But for Locke, the term idea is the term that covers everything. So, as Locke says already back in Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 8, whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks, that is an idea. Other philosophers might use the word representation, and maybe in more contemporary context we might use the word representation or something like that, a mental representation. Locke uses the word idea. Our sensation of yellow is an idea. We have an idea of God. We have an idea of space. These are all of them are ideas. Some are simple, some are complex, and so forth, but they're all ideas. And to give one example, Locke says, when I see a sphere, it is certain that the idea thereby imprinted in our mind is of a flat circle, variously shaded. So his thought is something complex in the world has all these different colors on it, and when we perceive such a thing, our mind operates on what it sees, and we perceive it as a sphere in terms of the broader operations of the mind and the judgment that's added to it. But we can analyze what's going on and separate the judgment by which we say that there's a sphere and the bare ideas that we have that get built up into a perception of a sphere. The bare idea, in this case he's saying, what is the actual idea that comes to us through the senses? A circle with different shadings. So if we want to go back to the beginning and back to the basis of all knowledge, we're going to look at the simple ideas before judgment is involved and before combination is involved, and we're going to look to the simple ideas of sensation. So we see a sugar cube. The sugar cube is sweet and white and cubical. It has all of those qualities. These qualities are in the whole sugar cube. As he says, these qualities are so united and blended that there's no separation. In other words, there isn't the white piece of the sugar cube and the cubical part and the sweet part. All those qualities are everywhere. But in terms of my experience, if we want to analyze the experience, the ideas that come to us are simple and unmixed. Each idea is itself nothing but one uniform appearance. I get the idea of sweetness, I get the idea of whiteness, and so forth. So we need some account of how it is that we perceive this whole sugar cube as having all these different qualities, and Locke is going to get to that, but he's suggesting here that if we're going to have that account, we first need to analyze its basic components. And the basic components of the experience of a white sugar cube are all of these simple ideas. So all our ideas ultimately derive from these simple ideas. Locke compares these to the atoms or ingredients of knowledge. Right? Atoms, again, he's not saying they are atoms, but as in the physical science, when we say everything is made out of atoms, those are the smallest parts. If we have that view of the physical world, Locke is saying the analogous thing holds in the case of the mind and knowledge and experience. Whatever kind of knowledge we have has to be built out of these basic atoms of simple ideas. So and as in the physical world with atoms, in the mental realm, the complex ideas then have to be made out of these simple ones. The understanding, he says, has the power to repeat, compare, and unite these simple ideas. That's it. It cannot create or destroy simple ideas. Now, where do these simple ideas come from? What are the different varieties of simple ideas? Some simple ideas come from one sense. Whiteness or yellowness or blueness come from sight. Solidity and impenetrability, or I should say solidity, Locke understands to be the same thing as impenetrability. That idea comes from touch. We feel that things resist. Sweetness or bitterness come from taste. Other simple ideas can come from sight and touch. He quickly passes over this issue, but he says extension, figure, motion, and rest, these we can get from either sight or touch. And we also get some of our simple ideas from reflection. The idea of volition or willing, perception, or thinking, and here these are synonyms for Locke. Volition is a Latin-derived word meaning willing, perception, the Latin-derived word meaning thinking. So we get those ideas from reflection. We just turn our attention to ourselves and we notice that we notice that we think, and Locke takes those therefore to be simple ideas. They're not built out of anything else. Some simple ideas come from, he says, sensation and reflection. The examples that he gives of these ideas that come from sensation and reflection, pleasure and pain, that is, accompanying ideas either of any of our senses or of reflection, we can feel pleasure and pain along with those. A little more tricky to understand are some of the other ones. He says the concept of existence is a simple idea that we can get along with any of our other ideas. As he says here in section 7, when ideas are in our minds, we consider them as being actually there, as well as we consider things to be actually without us. So in other words, he's saying when we have these ideas, at the same time that we have them, we also immediately get this other idea that the thing that we're thinking of exists. That could be either the sugar cube that we see in front of us we consider to exist, or our own idea of whiteness. We consider that to be an idea in my mind. I consider that idea to be something and to exist. And so Locke's claim is that this is actually the origin of our idea of existence. And this might be one of those abstract ideas that Locke's opponent might think was innate. And so here he's giving this account of the origin of our idea of existence. And I think you might look at this a little more closely and think about, is that really what the origin of the idea of existence is? When we consider something to exist and not exist, or talk about the possibility of existence, is this idea of existence just this idea that we get along with every other idea in this way? And some of the other ideas that we get from sensation and reflection that are kind of common to all of these ideas have the same sorts of potential problems. I'm not going to go more into it than that. The concept of unity. He says, and whatever we can consider as one thing, whether a real being, that is something external to us, or idea, suggests to the understanding the idea of unity. So this is something that the proponent of innate ideas, a Descartes, a Leibniz, they are going to object to this account here that says, well, we just get this idea of something being one thing and distinguish one from many just from the bare having of ideas this way. And Locke now goes on to talk about these other ideas of something having a power. Again, it comes with all our ideas, or a succession of things, that is especially a changing of things through time. Here again, Locke goes extremely quickly through his account of these things. He has this hugely long book, but he covers these points extremely briefly. And so he goes through existence and unity, power, succession. Where does this idea of time and succession come from and change? How do we get an idea of that? That might be considered a real difficult question for Descartes or Leibniz. What is this idea of time and succession? Locke answers it very quickly. If we look immediately into ourselves and reflect on what is observable there, we shall find our ideas always, whilst we are awake or having any thought, passing in train, one going and another coming without intermission. So someone like Leibniz, and especially later Kant, is going to object to this account of the origin of our conception of change, and is going to make a point something like, how can we even consider this to be a change unless we already have some sort of conception of something in which this change can occur? So we discussed this term idea, the most general term, and we talked about these simple ideas. Locke next wants to draw a distinction between ideas and qualities. So ideas are, again, whatever the mind perceives in itself or as the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding. That I call idea. And the power to produce any idea in our mind I call a quality of the subject in which that power is. So the quality is something in the thing itself, and to talk about an object having this or that quality is still referred to our own minds and how things have certain powers to produce different kinds of ideas. So when we use terms like cold or white or spherical, Locke wants to say we need to distinguish between how those terms are used to refer to ideas in our mind and how they're used to refer to modifications of matter. That's the point that Locke's making here in Chapter 8, page 111, Section 7, To discover the nature of our ideas the better and to discourse of them intelligibly, it will be convenient to distinguish them as they are ideas or perceptions in our minds, and as they are modifications of matter in the bodies that cause such perceptions in us. That, so we may not think, as perhaps usually is done, that they are exactly the images and resemblance of something inherent in the subject. Most of those sensations being in the mind no more the likeness of something existing without us than the names that stand for them are the likeness of our ideas, which yet, upon hearing, they are apt to excite in us. So here Locke alerts us to the fact that at least some of our ideas don't resemble the thing that they are ideas of. And we're going to be talking about that in detail in the next video. But for now, he's just saying this is a reason why it's important to distinguish in talking about this matter ideas from qualities. And when I say white or cold or spherical, again, I need to distinguish those terms as they refer to ideas that I have, and then as insofar as they refer to modifications of matter in bodies. And so then Locke goes on to say here in section 8, whatsoever the mind perceives in itself, or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, that I call idea. And the power to produce any idea in our mind, I call quality of the subject wherein that power is. Thus, a snowball having the power to produce in us the ideas of white, cold, and round, the powers to produce those ideas in us as they are in the snowball, I call qualities. And as they are sensations or perceptions in our understandings, I call them ideas. So Locke is going to go on in the next section to argue that many of our ideas do not resemble the actual bodies or the actual things of which they are ideas. These are the secondary qualities. And he's going to offer several arguments and thought experiments in support of that claim. But for now, and this is the last point we're going to discuss in this video, the point is just that to prepare the way for at least that possibility that some of our ideas, or maybe all of them, but he's going to say only some of them don't resemble objects, we need to make clear that when we use these terms that refer to qualities, we need to make sure that we distinguish the idea of a quality and a quality that is claimed to be in an object itself. After all, as he's going to go on to argue, starting in section 9, most ideas resemble qualities no more than names are like ideas, as Locke said in the passage I just read. So, for the next video, we're then going to focus on his account of primary and secondary qualities in sections 9 through 26 of chapter 8 of book 2. So that's the remainder of chapter 8.